Simon Cowell had never done this before. He stopped the show, turned off his microphone, and walked onto the stage. The producers in the control room were frantically signaling, the cameras kept rolling, and 3,000 people in the Dolby Theatre sat in stunned silence. No one knew what was happening. No one except Simon himself knew why he couldn't stay in his seat. And it all started with a 78-year-old woman holding a microphone like it was the last thing keeping her standing. Her name was Margaret. And what she did that night didn't just stop a television show. It changed the way Simon Cowell saw the world. But to understand that moment, you have to go back. Back to where it all began. Not on the stage, but in a small hospice room 3 months earlier, where Margaret sat beside a hospital bed holding the hand of the man she'd loved for 57 years. Margaret had lived a quiet life. She'd been a schoolteacher for 40 years, raised 3 children, and spent every Sunday morning singing in the church choir. Her voice had always been beautiful, the kind that made people stop and listen during hymns, but she'd never pursued it professionally. Life got in the way. Responsibilities. Family. Time. Her husband, Robert, had always told her she should have been a singer. "You've got a gift, Maggie," he'd say. "One day, you'll share it with the world." She'd smile and shake her head. "I share it with you," she'd reply. "That's enough." But now Robert was gone. And in the hollow space his absence left, Margaret realized something. She had never sung for anyone but him. And now, she never could again. In the weeks after his funeral, she barely spoke. Her children worried. Her friends visited, but she seemed distant, unreachable. She stopped going to church. Stopped singing altogether. Until one night, alone in the house they'd shared for half a century, she turned on the television and saw an episode of America's Got Talent. She watched as ordinary people stepped onto that stage and shared their gifts with the world. Some were young, some were old. Some had trained their whole lives, others had never performed before. But they all had one thing in common: they were brave enough to be seen. And in that moment, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She was going to audition. Not for fame. Not for a prize. But for Robert. To finally sing the song he'd always wanted to hear her perform in front of the world. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in line outside a Los Angeles hotel where AGT auditions were being held. She was surrounded by dancers in their 20s, magicians with elaborate props, singers with vocal coaches and stage parents. She clutched a small purse and wore a simple lavender dress. She looked out of place. She felt out of place. A production assistant asked for her name. "Margaret Sullivan," she said quietly. "And what's your talent?" the assistant asked, barely looking up from his clipboard. "I sing," Margaret replied. The assistant nodded and handed her a number. "Wait here. We'll call you." She waited 4 hours. By the time her number was called, her legs ached and her hands trembled slightly. But she walked into that audition room, stood in front of a camera and 3 producers, and sang a single verse of Unchained Melody. When she finished, there was silence. Then one of the producers leaned forward. "How old are you, Margaret?" 78, she said. "And you've never performed before?" "Not like this," she admitted. "I sang in a church choir. But my husband always said I should share my voice. He passed away 3 months ago." The room went quiet. The producer nodded slowly, then wrote something on his clipboard. "We'd like you to come back," he said. "For the live auditions. In front of the judges." Margaret's heart stopped. "Really? Really?" the producer said. "You've got something special." 2 months later, Margaret stood backstage at the Dolby Theatre. She could hear the audience, the music, the applause. Her hands were shaking. A stage manager handed her a microphone and gave her instructions. "Walk out when your name is called, stand on the X marked on the floor, wait for Simon to speak." "Are you nervous?" the stage manager asked. Margaret nodded. "Terrified." "Don't be," the woman said kindly. "Just sing like you're singing to someone you love." Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of Robert. And she whispered, "I will." When her name was called, she walked onto that stage. The lights were blinding. The audience was a blur of faces. And sitting behind the judges' table, arms crossed and expression unreadable, was Simon Cowell. He leaned into his microphone. "So, Margaret, tell us about yourself." She took a breath. "I'm 78 years old. I was a schoolteacher for 40 years. I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren." Her voice was steady, but soft. "And I lost my husband 3 months ago." The audience murmured sympathetically. Simon's expression didn't change. "And why are you here?" he asked. Margaret looked directly at him. "Because he always believed I had a gift. And I never had the courage to share it. Until now." Simon nodded slowly. "What are you going to sing?" "Unchained Melody," she said. "It was our song." Simon Cowell had heard 1,000 sob stories. He'd seen every kind of emotional manipulation, every attempt to tug at the judge's heartstrings. But something about the way Margaret stood there, small and fragile and unflinchingly honest, made him pause. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and leaned back in his chair. The music started. The opening notes of Unchained Melody filled the theater. And Margaret began to sing. Her voice was pure. It wasn't technically perfect. There were small cracks, moments where age and grief made it tremble. But it was real. It was raw. And it was devastating. She sang like she was singing to Robert. Like he was the only person in the room. Her eyes closed, her hands gripping the microphone, and every word carried the weight of 57 years of love and loss. The audience was silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting to applaud, but the breathless silence of people afraid to break something sacred. Simon sat frozen. His arms were no longer crossed. His hands were pressed flat against the desk. His jaw was tight. And for the first time in the history of the show, his eyes were visibly wet. Margaret reached the final verse. Her voice rose, trembling but strong, and she sang the last line like a prayer. When the music ended, she stood there, head bowed, tears streaming down her face. The audience erupted. People were on their feet, applauding, crying, shouting. The other judges were wiping their eyes. Howie Mandel was shaking his head in disbelief. Heidi Klum had both hands over her heart. But Simon didn't move. He sat there, staring at Margaret, his expression unreadable. And then, slowly, he did something no one expected. He stood up, walked out from behind the judges' table, and stepped onto the stage. The audience gasped. The applause stopped. Even the other judges looked confused. Simon never did this. He never broke protocol. He never left his seat during an audition. But he walked across that stage, stopped in front of Margaret, and looked at her with an expression that was no longer guarded, no longer cynical. It was just human. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. "That was..." He paused, struggling to find words. "That was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard." Margaret looked up at him, tears still streaming down her face, and nodded. She couldn't speak. Simon took a breath. "I've been doing this show for years. I've heard thousands of singers. And I've become very good at knowing when someone is performing for applause, or for fame, or because they want something." He paused. "But you weren't singing for any of that, were you?" Margaret shook her head. "I was singing for him." Simon nodded slowly. "I know." He looked out at the audience, then back at her. "I lost someone too. A long time ago. And I never had the courage to do what you just did. To honor them like that." The theater was silent. Every camera was on them. Simon reached out and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me why we do this show." And then, without another word, he walked back to the judges' table, sat down, and pressed the golden buzzer. Golden confetti rained down from the ceiling. The audience exploded into applause. The other judges were on their feet. And Margaret stood there, hands over her mouth, sobbing as the realization hit her, she'd done it. She'd shared her gift with the world. Just like Robert always said she would. Subscribe and leave a comment, because what happened after this moment will stay with you forever. Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, Simon found Margaret sitting alone in a dressing room. She was still holding the microphone, staring at it like she couldn't believe what had just happened. He knocked softly on the door. "May I come in?" She looked up, surprised. "Of course." He sat down across from her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Simon said, "I meant what I said out there. That was extraordinary." Margaret smiled, tears still in her eyes. "I almost didn't come. I thought I was too old. Too late." "You're not," Simon said firmly. "You proved that tonight." She nodded slowly, then looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "You said you lost someone? Were they the reason you do this?" Simon hesitated. He never talked about this. Not on camera, not in interviews, not even with people he considered friends. But something about Margaret, about her bravery, made him want to be honest. "My father," he said quietly. "He passed away years ago. And before he did, he told me that the most important thing in life wasn't success or money or fame. It was using whatever gifts you had to make people feel something real." Margaret nodded, understanding. "And that's what you saw tonight, wasn't it?" "That's exactly what I saw," Simon said. "You didn't just sing a song, Margaret. You reminded everyone in that theater, everyone watching at home, that it's never too late to be brave. To honor the people we've lost. To share our gifts, no matter how scared we are." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Thank you, Simon. For giving me this chance." He shook his head. "You gave it to yourself. I just pressed a button." But it was more than that. And Simon knew it. Because that night changed something in him. It reminded him why he'd started judging talent shows in the first place. Not to be the harsh critic, not to deliver cutting one-liners, but to recognize real talent when he saw it. And to give people a platform to share their gifts with the world. Margaret went on to the live shows. She didn't win the competition, but she didn't need to. Her performance went viral. Millions of people watched it, shared it, cried over it. She received letters from people around the world telling her that her courage inspired them to pursue their own dreams, to honor their own loved ones, to stop waiting for the right time, and just be brave. And Simon Cowell never forgot her. Years later, in interviews, when people asked him about the most memorable audition he'd ever seen, he always mentioned Margaret. "She taught me something I'd forgotten," he'd say. "That the best performances aren't about technique or showmanship. They're about truth." Because that's what Margaret gave him that night. Not a perfect performance. Not a flawless vocal. But something far more valuable. A reminder that vulnerability is not weakness. That grief can be transformed into beauty. And that it's never, ever too late to honor the people we love. The microphone Margaret held that night now sits in a display case in the America's Got Talent production offices. Simon insisted on it. "That microphone," he told the producers, "represents everything this show is supposed to be about. And every time a new season starts, every time the judges sit down at that table and prepare to watch another round of auditions, Simon thinks of Margaret. He thinks of the way she stood on that stage, small and scared and heartbreakingly brave. And he remembers why he does this. Not for the ratings. Not for the spectacle. But for the moments when someone steps into the light and shares a piece of their soul with the world. Those are the moments that matter. Those are the moments that change lives. Margaret's too. And Simon Cowell's. And everyone who witnessed what happened that night. The microphone Margaret held that night sits in a glass case in Simon's private office. Not in the AGT studios. In his personal space. He looks at it every day before he walks into another round of auditions. It reminds him of something he once knew but had forgotten, that the greatest talent isn't always wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it comes in the form of a 78-year-old woman who waited her entire life to be brave. Margaret never became famous. She went back to her small town, to her grandchildren, to her quiet life. But she changed something fundamental in everyone who heard her sing that night. She proved that courage doesn't have an expiration date. That love doesn't end when someone dies. And that the most powerful performances come from the deepest truth. Simon still thinks about her. On days when the auditions feel repetitive, when the acts blend together, when he's tempted to check his phone or make a sarcastic comment, he remembers Margaret standing under that spotlight, singing to a man who was no longer there. And he sits up straighter. Listens harder. Because somewhere in that next audition might be another Margaret. Another person who waited their whole life for this moment. Share this story and subscribe. Because some voices are worth waiting a lifetime to hear. And Margaret's was one of them.